By lantern light, the beads looked like candy cheap plastic cloudy with age strung tight on elastic. I lifted the little bracelet from a box buried in desert sand, and the name spelled itself out in silence, Elena. Wind moved across the flats and rattled the grass. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped and went quiet again. My gloves creaked when I closed my hand. It weighed almost nothing, and still it felt heavier than bone. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Back then, my days started with the same small ritual coffee in a white mug that never quite came clean, the hiss of the kettle and the hum of the police radio warming up on my kitchen counter. The sun came late over the oaks in my neighborhood, sliding in low and gold across the back fence. October in Austin has a way of pretending it's still summer mornings in the high 60s, afternoons leaning into the 80s, cicadas trying to convince you the heat will last forever. I'd lace my boots, tuck my badge where it belonged, and tell myself today would be routine. Some days even were. Cherrywood Lane sat about 6 miles from my place, a long crescent of pavement behind black iron and live oaks that had been there longer than most of the houses. The Holstead property came in near the top of the curve white columns, a porch deep enough to hide a summer orchestra hedges trimmed to perfect rectangles, a front walk that didn't stain when the oak pollen fell. When the gates swung open, the motor made a sound like a library door. Austin in the late 90s was shedding its small city skin. Downtown cranes started to poke up over the river. Tech money mixed with old money at charity auctions that smelled like perfume and shrimp cocktail. I worked the night shift more than I liked, and on the way back to the station, we'd sometimes idle past Cherrywood windows, down radio low, feeling that quiet, the rich buy by the acre. We weren't checking on anyone. We were stretching out the last minutes before paperwork. I met Nathaniel and Claire once before everything turned complicated. Not a case, just a charity gala at the Driscoll where the department sent a few of us to smile in uniform and keep an eye on the bar line. Nathaniel had the kind of handshake that says, "Let me steer this boat for you." Perfect cufflinks, even teeth a voice tuned to carry across a table without sounding like it was trying. Claire had a cream jacket draped just so over her shoulders and a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room for exactly 12 seconds at a time. She asked about the Riverside murals, said she liked the way Austin never quite matched its own reflection. When she walked away, the perfume she wore hung in the air like a closing door. Ruth Ellison, who lived 2 doors down from the Holsteads, walked her terrier at the same pace every morning. 3 miles, she said, measured on her husband's old Chevy odometer before he passed. We spoke at her mailbox more than once. She liked to narrate the street which lawn crew came on, which day, which delivery trucks idled with their lights on, who took in their garbage cans promptly, and who let them sit until the lid went crooked. She was the one who told me you could tell the season by the candles on the Holstead's dining table, spring for white tapers, fall for amber glass. Little things, nothing you'd write down unless you had reason. My partner, Ray Vega, favored black coffee that could float a horseshoe and a tie he wore loose the second we cleared the front steps of the station. He'd moved over from property crimes that spring and brought with him a sour humor that kept me steady on long drives. We didn't talk about big ideas. We talked about the small things that told the truth. The angle of a chair in a room, the dust line on a picture frame, a porch light left burning late. He liked to say people are consistent right up until they aren't. On a Friday in early October, the air finally broke. A stray front blew through overnight, pushed the heat off the city, and left us with a crisp morning that made you think about sweaters you didn't need. I remember it because my coffee tasted better and the streets felt sharper, like someone had turned the focus ring. I had a stack of follow-ups on my desk and a voicemail from my sister about a hand-me-down dresser she wanted me to haul. When I stepped out of the station, the sky was clean as glass. Around lunchtime, I ran into Officer Daniel Kraus outside a strip mall taqueria off Burnett. He'd been up late on a noise complaint near the river, and wore that crumpled look patrol officers get when the shift turns on them. He nodded at my badge. I nodded at his, and we traded the usual. He said, "You ever notice how the expensive houses are the quietest?" I said, "They're the ones you hear when they aren't." He laughed and shook his head. "Place up on Cherrywood's got a gate motor that sounds like my grandmother's sewing machine. I could pick it out of a lineup." He meant nothing by it. I pocketed the thought anyway. In this line of work, the good days run together. You move from one errand to the next, talk to a clerk who watched a wallet go missing, check on a storage unit where the lock keeps changing circle, back to a bar owner who says he didn't see the fight. Left blood on his back steps. The city carries you along. You read the weather, you read the faces, you tell yourself most people get to the end of their day with nothing worse than a late dinner. It's not a lie. It's just not the whole story. The Holsteads were part of the civic background. You saw their names in donor lists, on gala programs, on those glossy magazine pages that make every room look softer than it can possibly be. I didn't think of them much. They were people who lived behind a gate and hired a seasonal wreath for their front door. If you work long enough, you learn not to build stories about people you don't know. Still, something about them lingered, the way they seemed to glide, as if air moved around them differently. The first faint crease in the picture didn't look like anything at all. It was a Tuesday, 4 days after that crisp morning, and I was driving south on Mopac in the early evening when I saw a sedan ease into the lane next to me. Not a Mercedes two-plane for that. A dark car with two silhouettes. The passenger had a scarf around her neck, though the air was warm. A small movement. Her hand lifting the scarf adjusted the profile turned toward the glass. If you work long enough in a city, you get good at recognizing shapes. For a moment, I felt certain it was Claire. Then the sedan slipped behind a box truck and was gone. Maybe I wanted to see something. Maybe I did. 2 days later, I passed Cherrywood in the late afternoon on my way back from a witness interview near the university. The light was leaning amber. The guard at the neighborhood gate was reading a paperback, one leg crossed over the other, a styrofoam cup at his elbow. When I turned in, the Holstead hedges were trimmed so tight they threw a perfect shadow on the lawn. A florist's van idled near the curb. The driver was checking a clipboard, then the house, then the clipboard again. He looked uncertain, like someone had told him to leave the bouquet on the back steps, but the back steps didn't match what he'd imagined. I glanced at the porch, not to snoop, just the way you glance at a porch, and noticed the door knocker was tilted a 1/4 inch off center. Nothing more. I kept rolling. Later that week, Ruth waved me over at her mailbox. "You ever have a night where the air won't settle?" she asked. I told her coffee fixes what the air won't. She said she'd walked past the big house and heard music drifting from somewhere deep inside a piano line, slow and sure, then a sudden stop, like a hand had come down flat on the keys. "Maybe I imagined it," she said. "Sound carries funny in this weather." I said it does. She nodded at the hedges, then down at the terrier, and we moved on. Small absences began to stack up like unpaid bills. A caterer told a cousin of mine she'd delivered a tray of canapés to the Holsteads on a Saturday afternoon and found the side gate propped open with a brick the kind you stick under a paint can. High wind, she said, though the live oaks were still. A new security company truck sat outside their gates on Monday morning with blue magnets on the doors and 2 employees, smoking by the hood, both watching the house the way you watch a stage before the curtain moves. None of it rose to the level of a phone call. All of it made a note in my head. I kept telling myself it was just the season changing, light sliding quicker off the front steps, shadows turning, early neighbors getting used to cool evenings again. Evenings can make you suspicious. You see the same street at a different angle, and it stops looking like the one you know. I tried to keep my eyes on my own work. I had a stack of reports that wouldn't sign themselves, and a mother calling twice about a son who hadn't made it to probation. The city kept breathing as it always does, buses exhaling at corners, joggers counting their steps, high school kids leaning off the backs of pickup trucks on a Friday night like the road would never end. What I remember most from those last hours of normal is light. The way it fell across the Holstead's white porch like poured milk. The way it caught on the edges of cut crystal when a dining room lamp was the only thing burning in the big front windows. I saw that lamp on more than once when I turned onto Cherrywood to cut back toward the highway. You tell yourself someone just forgot to switch it off. You tell yourself a house like that doesn't run on habit. It runs on intention. So if the light is on, someone meant it. Ray and I sat in the parking lot behind the station one evening and split a stale donut he swore tasted fine if you avoided the icing. He told me his nephew had learned to ride without training wheels and wanted to show me a picture. The boy was going all elbows and knees down a cracked driveway, mouth wide with terror and triumph. Balance, Ray said, like it was a word you could pin down. That's the whole trick. He tucked the photo away and asked if I'd ever been inside the big house on Cherrywood. I said I hadn't. Looks like a place where nothing bad happens, he said. He didn't mean it. He was testing the balance of the words. Toward the end of that week, the weather shifted again. A thin rain settled in, not enough to soak, just enough to shine the pavement and make the streetlights bloom halos. I drove home slow. The wipers squeaked. In my rearview mirror, the city's reflection broke and came together. Broke and came together. When I passed Cherrywood, the guardhouse was empty. Newspaper folded on the desk. The neighborhood felt like a stage set, waiting on actors. I slept uneasily that night and woke twice to the sound of my refrigerator motor kicking on. At 4 a.m, I stood at the window with my mug and looked out at the dark where my yard becomes the alley. Rain ticked on the gutter. The street lamp at the corner made everything look like it had been dipped in tin. I thought about the scarf in the car on Mopac, the florist's hesitation, the side gate propped with a brick. None of it wanted to become a story. It wanted to stay a collection of small, unrelated things. On Saturday, just before dusk, I found myself circling past Cherrywood again. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. The iron gates were closed, as always, the keypad light a steady green. Through the trees, I could see the dining room in soft focus table set, candles weighting the glassware, catching what was left of the day. The porch light glowed steady against the rain. A delivery truck slowed at the curb, idled, and moved on. The motor of the gate hummed once short, like a breath held and released, and then the street went quiet. I watched the front walk. The hedges held their perfect line. The house did what good houses do. It kept its secrets by looking like it had none. When I pulled away, I checked my mirror out of reflex. The porch stayed lit. The rain picked up. Somewhere behind me, a phone began to ring in a house that was not mine and kept ringing and did not stop. The phone didn't stop that night. First, Ruth called, her voice thin and uncertain, saying the Holstead's porch light had been burning since before sundown, and the paper still sat at the end of the drive. I told her I'd check it out on my way in, figuring it would be nothing. A late dinner, a tripped breaker, some small oversight in a house big enough to hide one. But by the time I parked beneath the live oaks, that feeling I used to get before something turned bad had already crept up the back of my neck. The air was still the kind of stillness you only hear before a storm, when even the crickets quiet down. The gates stood wide open. A single lamp glowed behind the sheer curtains of the dining room, painting soft yellow stripes across the grass. I remember thinking how polite it looked, that light like someone had left it on for company that would never come. I walked up the brick path, slow, the gravel crunching under my boots. The front door wasn't locked. It wasn't even latched. Inside, the air felt wrong, cooler than it should have been for a Texas evening, like the AC had been left running for days. The house had that smell I've come to know too well, perfume gone stale. A trace of cooking oil, something faintly metallic underneath. On the kitchen counter, Claire's handbag lay open, lipstick tubes and receipts scattered out like she'd been reaching for something and never finished. The alarm panel beside the door blinked dark, disabled. The granite counters still held a half-emptied wine bottle, 2 glasses rimmed with fingerprints, and a dinner table set for 2 untouched. No struggle, no sound. Just absence pressed into every corner of the room. I called it in and waited on the front steps while the cicadas started up again. The glow from the house made the hedges look taller like walls. When patrol arrived, I walked Officer Krause through the scene room by room. Upstairs, the bed was turned down neatly but unslept in. A nightgown folded at the edge. His razor, her jewelry. Everything where it belonged. I checked the garage. No car. Their Mercedes wasn't on the property, though the keys to everything else hung in place on a wooden rack by the door. We canvassed the yard, the back patio, the pool house. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks beyond their own. Even the dog's dish was full, the water beginning to film over. By dawn, the driveway was crowded patrol cars, command van, one unmarked sedan that belonged to Ray Vega. He stepped out carrying 2 cups of coffee, handed me one without a word. His tie was already loose. So he said, looking toward the open gate, "This is what happens when rich people vanish." I didn't answer. We both knew the headlines would write themselves. The neighbors stood at the end of their drives in robes whispering across hedges. Ruth waved me over long enough to say she'd seen the Holstead's lights go dark around 9 p.m. the night before, then back on again near midnight. No cars, no visitors, just light flickering through curtains like someone walking room to room. The first days blurred into routine press calls, missing persons bulletins, search dogs tracing the perimeter of the estate. Helicopters swept the hill country. Nothing new. Every lead felt borrowed from the last case that didn't end well. By the 3rd day, I stopped expecting anything. Then Krause called from the tow yard. He'd been checking abandoned vehicles south of the city and found one that matched a partial VIN from the Holstead's Mercedes. 40 miles out, parked half off a dirt road near a pecan orchard. Keys still in the ignition. He said, "You'll want to see this." The car looked ordinary from a distance, just rain-streaked silver catching the morning light. But up close, details spoke louder than any witness could. The sunroof cracked. Rain had bled through onto the seats, leaving a tide line on the leather. The glove box was forced open. Insurance cards sat under a name I didn't recognize, David Rowe. A faint smear darkened the passenger side floor mat, the color of rust, but too deliberate in shape. When I leaned closer, I saw it wasn't rust at all. It was dried blood, just enough to make your stomach drop, but not enough to tell a story. The passenger seat belt hung twisted, snapped at the latch, and carved into the dashboard, shallow but clear, was a single initial C. I remember the sound of the evidence bag crinkling as I slipped a receipt into it, a gas station slip dated 3 days after the Holsteads had supposedly vanished. That one detail changed everything. If the car had been filled after they were gone, someone was keeping their trail alive. Ray leaned on the hood, watching the horizon. So he said quietly, "Who's still driving their car?" I didn't have an answer. Back in the city, the press had latched onto the story. Every newscast showed the same image, the Holsteads smiling at a charity event, her in a pearl dress, him in a navy suit, a couple frozen at the top of their world. Now they were missing, and everyone wanted to know if they'd run or been taken. Reporters parked outside the gates asking neighbors for quotes. Ruth wouldn't talk to them. She just brought me lemonade one afternoon while I stood by my cruiser, said she hoped we'd find them soon. They weren't unkind. She told me just guarded, like they'd practiced being normal. I wrote that down, though I wasn't sure what to make of it. We processed the Mercedes, dusted, photographed, pulled the VIN history. When the lab called back, the voice on the other end sounded unsettled. The blood from the floor mat belonged to 2 people, neither of them Nathaniel or Claire. That revelation felt like stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. Ray exhaled through his teeth. "So who bled in their car?" he said. The silence that followed was answer enough. The next clue came from the kitchen credit statements in Claire's name showing charges in Las Cruces, New Mexico just weeks before they vanished. Boutique hotels, art supply stores, cash withdrawals. I spread the papers across her granite counter, tracing her name over and over until it started to look false. The signatures varied slightly, some neat, some rushed, one in a different slant altogether. "She's playing with her handwriting," I said to Ray. He looked over my shoulder, nodding slowly. "Or someone else is." It was the kind of pattern that pulls you under one false name, leading to another, one lie stacked inside the next. The Mercedes documents matched the New Mexico alias. David Rowe, Las Cruces. I booked 2 tickets the next morning and told Ray to pack light. The drive out was long, the kind that blurs time. Endless desert sun bleeding white across the sky. Gas stations every 40 miles selling dust-covered soda and postcards no one mailed anymore. We reached Las Cruces before noon. The Desert Star Motel sat off the highway faded sign, blinking air thick with dust. The manager behind the counter looked like he hadn't slept in years. When I showed him the photo, his brow furrowed. "Rowe," he said. "Yeah, him. Came through about 3 weeks before Halloween. Paid cash. Had a woman with him, stylish brown hair, older maybe. Stayed 3 nights, room 12. Keys left on the table when they left." He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the register. Housekeeper said they were arguing the second night. Loud, then quiet. The room still smelled faintly of mildew and old cigarette smoke. I ran my hand over the dresser scratches across the top like something heavy had been dragged. Near the bathroom door, faint marks carved into the wood caught my eye. CH. Claire's initials. It wasn't vandalism. It was deliberate, almost like she wanted someone to know she'd been there. Ray crouched near the sink holding up a small plastic vial. The label was torn, but 2 pale blue capsules rattled inside. He bagged it, and we stood there for a moment, neither of us speaking. Outside, the sun beat down so hard the pavement shimmered. At the local station, a sergeant helped us dig through archives. "David Rowe," he said, flipping through an old folder. "That name's popped before property deal outside Santa Fe never built anything." Then gone. He slid a photo across the desk, a grainy surveillance still of a man at a bank counter, tall, dark hair, glasses. Even blurred, I knew the face. Nathaniel. He wasn't posing as himself. He'd built a new man entirely. Ray looked at me, his voice low. So he had another life. Maybe she did too. I nodded. Maybe they both did, and they finally ran out of space to hide. That night, the diner off the highway was nearly empty. Neon buzzing jukebox silent. We sat in a booth with coffee gone cold files spread between the salt shaker and the napkin holder. "Let's say they planned this," Ray said. "New names, new towns disappear clean. What goes wrong?" I stared at the window at our reflections blurred in the glass. "Blood in the car," I said. "That's what goes wrong." By morning, the desert light had softened. We drove out toward the plot Nathaniel David Rowe had bought in '96. 40 acres of nothing. Dry scrub, a leaning windmill silence that pressed against your ears. The local registrar's trailer sat off the highway papers stacked to the ceiling fan rattling. He thumbed through, the deed shrugged. "Bought it cash," he said. "Never did a thing with it. Kids sneak out there sometimes, shoot cans. Sheriffs had calls for gunfire, that's it. I remember standing out there with the heat rippling off the ground, the world so still it made your heartbeat sound like thunder." "Maybe he wasn't building," I said to Ray. "Maybe he was burying." We brought in a radar unit, rolled it slow across the dirt. For hours, nothing but static hum. Then a shape appeared on the screen, long, clean lines too perfect for nature. 4 feet down. I knelt, traced the outline with my hand on the dry soil, felt the grit slide under my nails. "Mark it," I said. "We dig at dawn." That evening, back at the motel, I couldn't shake the image, the emptiness of the land. The carved initials in the door, the way silence seemed to follow us from Texas to New Mexico, like a shadow. I called the station, left a message for Kraus to pull every missing persons case from the last 5 years that overlapped with any alias tied to the Holsteads. When I hung up, the room felt smaller. The desert wind scraped against the window screen like fingernails. Ray had fallen asleep in the next room, television flickering light across his face. I sat at the small desk, staring at the vial of blue capsules sealed in its evidence bag. Somewhere outside, a train passed low and distant, the sound rolling over the horizon like a memory too heavy to hold. I wrote a single line in my notebook before closing it for the night. They didn't vanish. They changed skins. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The motel sign outside buzzed faintly through the curtains. I could already feel the heat building. We loaded the gear-packed water and started toward the site. As the sky turned that pale, unforgiving blue, I thought about Ruth back in Austin, her small voice asking when the air would settle. I thought about the open handbag, the half-finished wine, the carved letter on the dashboard. Everything pointed to a truth waiting just below the surface, something ugly wearing the mask of normal life. By the time we reached the land, the wind had gone still. We began to dig. The first shovel struck hard ground, then dust, the air filled with the smell of dry clay and iron. I kept my eyes on that marked spot, waiting for what the earth was about to give back. What we found that morning changed the shape of the case, and in ways I still can't fully explain, it changed the shape of me too. But that came later. In that moment, all I could hear was the scrape of metal on soil steady, certain cutting into a silence that had waited 22 years to be broken. The first shovel hit something solid just after sunrise. It wasn't much at first, a dull thud like wood under compacted dirt, but it changed the air. Everyone stopped talking at once. The morning light was still pale and low across the desert, long shadows stretching from our boots toward the horizon. I knelt beside the hole, brushing away the loose soil with my gloved hand until the outline took shape. It wasn't a coffin. It was a box maybe 4 feet long, weathered and dry, the kind of chest you'd expect to find in an attic not 4 feet beneath the New Mexico sand. The hinges were rusted to powder, and when the lock gave under pressure, the smell of old paper and metal came up first. A smell that clung to your clothes no matter how long you stood in the wind. Inside were bundles of documents wrapped in oilcloth. Birth certificates, passports, property deeds, all tied up in neat stacks. None of the names matched, but every photo had a face I knew. Nathaniel Clare and a handful of strangers I'd never seen before. I lifted one passport, the lamination peeling from heat and age, and my stomach tightened when I saw the signature. It wasn't Nathaniel's handwriting, but the photo was his. Ray crouched beside me, his face gray with dust. "What the hell were they doing?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I was too busy counting. There were at least a dozen different identities, different names, dates of birth, even nationalities. And beneath the papers, wrapped in a second layer of cloth, was jewelry. Rings, watches, necklaces, some men's, some women's. Nothing valuable enough to pawn, but too personal to be random. And then at the bottom, a smaller box. I don't know what made me hesitate before opening it, but I did. Maybe because the weight of it felt different. When I lifted the lid, the light caught something bright plastic beads strung together. The letters faded, but still readable, ELENA. I remember staring at that little bracelet like it might start speaking. It wasn't just out of place. It didn't belong to this kind of story at all. Children's things never do. Ray leaned over my shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not theirs." I nodded. "No, It isn't. For a long time, nobody said anything. The wind moved through the brush dry and thin, carrying the sound of the digging crew packing up behind us. The desert had its own kind of silence, a silence that doesn't ask for answers because it already knows you won't find the right ones. That night, we spread everything across the bed of our motel room. The documents, the jewelry, the bracelet, each tagged and bagged. I called the lab in Austin to rush the prints and DNA. Hours later, my phone rang. The analyst's voice was low, careful, like she was still trying to make sense of what she'd seen. 2 of the passports matched open missing persons cases, one from Phoenix, one from Denver. Both vanished in the mid-90s, both still unsolved. That meant the Holsteads weren't just living under aliases. They were living under names that once belonged to real people, people who had disappeared. Ray sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. "So what are they, Evelyn?" he asked. "Identity thieves. Killers." I didn't answer right away. The motel's old air conditioner rattled against the wall, throwing out more noise than air. "Maybe both," I said finally. "Or maybe something we don't have a name for yet." I picked up the bracelet again. It was small enough to fit around 2 fingers. Whoever she was, I said quietly, she didn't vanish by choice. The next morning, we were back in Austin. The evidence filled half a conference table, photographs of the chest, itemized lists, prints the lab reports, still damp from toner. The task force was already growing 2 FBI agents from Albuquerque, 1 analyst from Dallas, and a detective from Denver who'd worked one of the original missing persons cases. We were all looking at the same thing and trying to see it from different angles. I walked them through what we'd found, ending with the bracelet. It sat in the center of the table like a wound. One of the agents, a tall man with a clipped voice, leaned forward. "You're saying the Holsteads might have abducted these identities from missing people?" he asked. I said I'm saying they were connected. How deep, I don't know yet. For days I barely slept. We pulled every file tied to their aliases, every credit record, every passport application, every photo. The web grew wider by the hour. 6 disappearances between 1993 and 1998. All families, all with 1 child. Cars left intact, bank accounts active for days after the families vanished receipts for hotels, gas, and art purchases in New Mexico and Texas. The pattern wasn't coincidence, it was choreography. Every move the same, every ending silent. I went back to the Holsteads' house alone one evening. The gate still creaked when I pushed it open. The lawn had grown wild in the weeks since we'd closed it off. The housekeeper had taken a job elsewhere. The only light came from my flashlight, cutting a narrow path through the dust. I walked room to room, tracing the edges of their life, his cologne still faint in the closet, her perfume bottles lined up on the vanity like soldiers left behind. In the study, I found a narrow black binder tucked behind a row of ledgers. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Families smiling at restaurants, children playing in parks, couples posing beside cars. None of the names written on the backs matched, but one image froze me cold. A dinner party photo of the Holsteads smiling for the camera. Behind them, blurred in the background, stood a little girl wearing a plastic bracelet with beads spelling out ELENA. When I took that binder into the briefing room the next morning, the mood shifted. Nobody had to say what we were all thinking. They weren't just stealing names, Ray said quietly. They were keeping track. I nodded, and someone was keeping track of them. The photos weren't trophies, they were records. There was a logic to them, a system like someone documenting transactions. The question was who else had access to it. A week later, we met with a woman named Rosa Morales in Phoenix. She was in her 60s, soft-spoken hands trembling slightly as she held a cup of coffee she never drank from. Her granddaughter Elena had vanished in 1995 with her parents during a weekend trip north. The car had been found at a rest stop doors, unlocked lunch still on the picnic table. No trace of them since. When I showed her the bracelet, she reached for it with both hands, whispering her granddaughter's name like a prayer. She wore it every day, she said. We thought maybe she lost it that day. But you found it. Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. You find who took her. After that, the case stopped being a mystery and started being something else, something heavier. We weren't chasing ghosts anymore. We were chasing people who had turned other people into ghosts. Back at the field office, the walls were covered in maps, red pins connecting cities, strings tracing routes like arteries across the Southwest. Phoenix, Denver, Austin, Santa Fe. Every point linked to a family that had disappeared, and everyone led back in some form to the Holsteads. Late one night, I sat alone in the evidence room with the bracelet under a magnifier. The plastic was scuffed in places, the letters worn thin. Beneath one bead, faint traces of something darker had seeped into the groove, old blood too little to test. I thought about the Holsteads' smiling photos, their perfect parties, the way neighbors described them as unshakable. I thought about how easy it is for people like that to hide in plain sight, how money buys not just distance, but invisibility. Around 3 a.m, the lab called again. They'd lifted partial prints from the jewelry box inside the desert chest. One belonged to Nathaniel, another unidentified, and 3 smaller sets, child-sized, multiple individuals. That detail hollowed me out. Children, I said aloud, though no one was there to hear. The analyst paused. At least 3 different ones, she confirmed. None match Elena. When I hung up, the silence in the room was unbearable. The kind that fills your ears until you start to hear your own pulse. I looked around at the stacks of files, at all the faces staring up from missing persons flyers, families frozen at the exact moment before they vanished. I realized that whatever we were uncovering wasn't just the Holstead's secret. It was something they'd been a part of, something organized, deliberate, and still moving beneath the surface. The next morning, Ray found me asleep at my desk. He set a cup of coffee beside my hand, then looked at the board behind me. They weren't victims, he said quietly. They were part of it. I met his eyes. Maybe. But if they were, someone still erased them. And whoever did it isn't done. We stood there for a long time, the 2 of us in that humming office, surrounded by faces that deserved answers. Outside, the desert sun was just starting to rise, the first light cutting across the parking lot. I thought about the Holsteads' abandoned mansion back in Austin, the candles frozen mid-drip, the wine glasses still half full. Somewhere between the life they built and the one they pretended to live, the truth had gone to ground. And now that we'd started digging, the ground was beginning to move. That night, as I packed up to leave, I noticed a shadow of something on the edge of my desk. A plain envelope I hadn't seen before, no name, no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed the chest we'd dug up in New Mexico, still half buried, still closed. It had been taken before we got there. Scrawled across the bottom in neat, unfamiliar handwriting were 4 words: "You're looking the wrong way." I sat there for a long time, staring at that photo, the edges curling slightly in the heat of the lamp. Then I turned it over, half expecting another message. There was none. Only the blank white back, as empty as the desert that had given up its first secret and was now daring us to find the rest. The Polaroid sat on my desk all night. I must have turned it over 100 times, but the back stayed blank, as if whoever left it wanted the silence to do the talking. By dawn, the fluorescent light in my office had gone from white to the color of paper left too long in the sun. Ray came in holding a styrofoam cup, saw the photo, and froze. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. "It was waiting for me when I got back from the lab," I said. He studied it jaw tight. "Someone's been in here." I nodded. "Or someone's been ahead of us the whole time." The words hung there heavier than I meant them to be. By mid-morning, a call came from Albuquerque. They'd picked up an informant, said he knew the Holsteads, said he could explain the pattern we'd been chasing. I didn't believe it at first. Every case attracts its share of storytellers looking to trade rumors for leniency. But when the deputy said the man had names and dates that matched our files, we drove out the same day. The interview room was windowless, all hum and flicker, the kind of space that seems to flatten people. He called himself Daniel, though he admitted it wasn't his real name. Mid-40s, calm, almost polite, the sort of person who's lived long enough to know how to measure every word. "You don't know what you're standing in," he said, hands folded. "The Holsteads weren't random. They were chosen." I asked by who. He looked toward the one-way mirror like he could see through it. "We called it the Veil," he said. "Not a cult, no symbols, no robes, none of that. It was a circle. People with money, power, appetite. They wanted to live without consequence. You join, you disappear from one life and build another behind the veil." His voice was steady, almost detached. The Holsteads were perfect for it. Pretty, charming. They fit in anywhere. He built the paper trail. She handled the art, the movement of money. They helped others vanish too. Ray leaned forward. And the families. Daniel looked down, rubbed his palms together. "Collateral," he said softly. "The ones whose identities got recycled. Couples with one child, easy to erase. Easier to replace." For a moment, the room felt airless. I asked him what that meant, and he met my eyes for the first time. You take a family with a single child, you take them all, and there's no one left to ask questions. The veil takes their names, their homes, their histories, wipes them clean. In exchange, new identities are born from the old. The Holsteads managed that process, until they didn't. He told us they'd started keeping their own records, files, photos, leverage, insurance against the people they served. They got scared, he said. They wanted out. But no one leaves. The veil doesn't kill. It erases. I asked him how he knew all this, and he smiled without warmth. "Because I was one of them," he said. Until I wasn't. We asked for names, but he shook his head. "You already know some," he said. "Check the guest books from the galleries, the property records in Santa Fe, the donors behind your own city's foundations. You'll find us everywhere just beneath the surface." When we left the room, Ray exhaled slow. "You believe him?" he asked. I didn't answer. Belief wasn't part of the job, but I knew the way his voice trembled when he said, "No one leaves that wasn't performance." That was memory. That night I drove without direction. The highway out of Albuquerque runs flat for miles before the land starts folding into canyon. The kind of country where headlights seem to swallow the road whole. I pulled over near a rest stop, stepped out into the dark, and looked up at the stars. The desert has a way of making you feel watched, even when you're alone. I thought of Daniel's warning, the Holstead's chest buried in that same kind of silence, and the bracelet that still sat in my evidence case. Somewhere in all of it was a pattern that felt less like chance and more like ritual. Back at the office, the FBI analysts traced flight records under the Holstead's aliases. Cash payments, no luggage, 2 or 3 passengers each time. Routes that followed the same cities where the families had vanished. The implication was their ugly and unavoidable people were being moved, not just erased on paper. Ray kept pacing the room, rubbing his neck. "You think the Holsteads were smuggling kids?" he asked. "I think they were keeping balance," I said. "Trading lives for new ones." Neither of us spoke after that. 2 days later, Interpol sent a fax, an old hotel registry from Prague dated October 2001. The names jumped off the page, David Rowe and Anna Vale. The same aliases the Holsteads had used before they disappeared, 5 years after we thought they were gone. I printed the page and slid it across to Ray. He read it twice. "So they're alive?" he asked. I shook my head. "Or someone wants us to think they are." He leaned back in his chair. "You ever wonder if we're chasing ghosts?" "Evelyn," I said, "if they're ghosts, they still know our names." The next morning, the lab tech called me down. They'd re-examined one of the forged passports from the chest under infrared. Beneath the laminate, faint indentations formed a string of numbers. Coordinates, somewhere in southern Utah. When she said the word canyon, my stomach sank. We'd seen too many disappearances end in places like that. Within 2 days, we were on a plane to Salt Lake City. From there, a ranger's truck carried us deep into the sandstone maze past miles of wind-carved rock that looked like it could swallow anything. The air there has its own silence, thicker, almost reverent. We found the mark near a canyon wall etched into the stone, a circle with a single vertical line running through it, the same symbol we'd seen on the chest hinges. Beneath it, the sand was disturbed. We dug for hours, sweat mixing with dust until the shovel hit metal. The box was smaller this time, newer, the wood clean. Inside were photographs of Nathaniel and Claire alive, smiling in a European square, the clock tower behind them marking the year 1999. Beneath the photos, a folded note written in Claire's hand. "We are alive," it read, "but not for long. If you found this, the veil is already behind you." I felt the ground tilt. Ray read the note twice, his voice low. "So they're warning us." I nodded. Or they're confessing. We camped by the canyon rim that night, the fire burning small, both of us too tired to speak. I remember the sound of the wind moving through the rocks, low and steady like breathing. I kept thinking about that phrase, "the veil is behind you." It didn't sound like paranoia. It sounded like a fact. On the drive back, a black sedan appeared in the rearview mirror about 10 miles outside the park. At first I thought it was a tourist, maybe another investigator, but every time we slowed, it slowed. When we pulled off at a gas station, it lingered at the shoulder engine idling. We waited. After a few minutes, it turned off toward the highway and disappeared among the trucks. Ray didn't say a word, but I saw his knuckles whiten on the steering wheel. That night in the motel outside Las Vegas, I checked the room twice before locking the door. The note and the photographs were sealed in an evidence folder on the desk. I sat there staring at them until the air conditioner's hum became the only sound. Just after midnight, I saw something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The folder had been moved. Not much, maybe an inch, but enough for me to know it wasn't where I'd left it. I opened it slowly. The contents were still there, the note, the photos, but in the center lay a new Polaroid. It showed me walking out of that Utah Canyon file under my arm, taken from a distance. I called Ray. He arrived in under 10 minutes, gun-drawn eyes scanning the room. "This is a message," he said quietly. "They're letting us know they can reach us any time." I stared at the photo until the edges blurred. "Just like they did with the Holsteads," I said. "Exactly like that." For a long time we didn't move. The hum of the AC filled the silence, too loud, too steady. Then Ray spoke again, his voice flat. "We're not investigating anymore, Evelyn. We're inside it." I barely slept. When dawn finally came, the sky over the desert was the color of bone. We drove to the nearest field office, turned over the note, the photos, and the Polaroid. The agents promised to handle the analysis, but their faces gave them away. They didn't want this case any more than we did. On the flight back to Texas, I looked out the window at the endless spread of desert, thinking about how many secrets were buried out there, how many names had been stripped from the living and given to the dead. By the time we landed, my phone had 3 missed calls from an unknown number and 1 voicemail that lasted exactly 6 seconds. No words, just breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. When I played it again, I realized it wasn't random. It was timed, 4 seconds a pause, then 2 shorter breaths. Morse code for the letter H. I sat there listening to it on repeat until the plane emptied. Outside the window, the sky over Austin was turning violet. The kind of twilight that makes everything look softer than it really is. I thought about the Holstead's last note, the little girl's bracelet, and Daniel's warning that the veil doesn't kill, it erases. And for the first time since this began, I understood what that meant. You don't have to die to disappear. You just have to be rewritten. When the airport lights flickered on, I shut off my phone and looked at my reflection in the glass. For a moment, I didn't recognize the face staring back. That was the moment I knew we weren't just chasing the Holsteads anymore. We were becoming them. I didn't sleep much after the flight home. Every sound in my house felt amplified, the click of the refrigerator, the settling of the floorboards, even my own breathing. I'd been inside too many empty rooms over the years not to know when the air carried memory. The Holstead case wasn't over, but it had already carved its place inside me. I could feel it every time I closed my eyes, the photograph left in my room, the faint hum of that recorded breathing, the weight of a note written by two people who had tried to escape a darkness that moved like smoke. Within a week, federal jurisdiction swallowed the investigation. Files I'd built by hand were copied and boxed. When I asked where they were going, the answer came in the kind of tone you don't challenge above classification. Ray and I were kept on as liaisons, though it didn't take long to realize that meant keeping quiet more than it meant keeping watch. The official statement read that the Holsteads were presumed deceased in connection with organized identity fraud and human trafficking offenses. But I knew better. Presumed was the word bureaucrats use when the truth is inconvenient. A few months later, one last package arrived at the station. No return address, no markings beyond a postmark from the Czech Republic. Inside was a small leather notebook, Claire's handwriting again familiar and sharp. Most of the pages were torn out, but the first remained. It began with a line that still catches in my throat when I think of it. We were both predator and prey. The rest read like confession and eulogy all at once. She wrote of the Veil not as an organization, but as a contagion, an idea that fed on people who believed they could reinvent themselves by erasing others. You don't join it, she wrote. You breathe it in. Her words filled in what the evidence couldn't. How she and Nathaniel built false names for clients who wanted to vanish runaways, fugitives, sometimes people with nothing left but shame. How the money grew and the danger grew with it. How one night they realized their clients weren't escaping anything, they were feeding something that needed new lives to sustain itself. When they tried to leave, they began documenting every transaction, every meeting, hoping the truth might protect them. But all it did was sign their own death warrant. The final entry said only this: "If you're reading this, we didn't make it. Tell them what silence costs." The Bureau never confirmed whether the notebook was real. They said it could have been planted part of a campaign to muddy the case. Maybe they were right, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I'd stared at enough of Claire's old notes, her signatures, the delicate way she looped her L's and crossed her T's like she was sketching a secret. It was her. I know it was. In early spring, a multi-agency task force released a quiet statement a man identified as Randall Clark, a drifter tied to several missing persons cases, had been arrested in Montana. He'd been living out of a camper near the old rail yards, using aliases that connected back to the Holsteads' forged identities. His fingerprints matched those found on the jewelry box from the desert chest. When they brought him in, he didn't resist, didn't deny. He just said, they followed the rules until they stopped. That's why they're under the roots now. It was a strange choice of words, but not the strangest I'd heard in my career. I sat across from him once, just long enough to ask a single question. "Who told you to bury them?" He smiled, a small dry twist of his mouth. "Told me," he said. "They asked for it." I remember the sound of the door closing behind me after that, how final it felt, like the case had swallowed its own tail. He died before trial stroke in his sleep. Whatever truth he carried went with him. After his death, the investigation unraveled the way these cases do when the living lose interest and the dead can't speak. Evidence was sealed. Media attention faded. The Holstead's mansion was auctioned to a developer who bulldozed the pool and repainted the walls. I went back once before it sold. The air inside was stale heavy with that stillness that settles over places where too much has happened. In the study, dust covered everything but a single patch on the desk, the exact size of a photograph. I stood there a long time wondering what image had been there, who had taken it, and what kind of life it had belonged to. Ray transferred out of homicide the next year, said the job was starting to feel like a slow kind of drowning. We still meet for coffee sometimes, though it's quieter now between us. We talk about our families, the weather, anything but that case. Every now and then, when the conversation stalls, he'll look down and say, "You think they're really gone?" And I'll say, the only honest thing left, I hope so. I kept Claire's notebook for a while before turning it over to archives. For months, I'd find myself opening it to that first line, tracing the ink with my finger. We were both predator and prey. There was something painfully human in it, an admission most people never make. Maybe that's why her story still sits heavy with me. Not because she was innocent, because she wasn't. And because sometimes understanding a monster doesn't mean forgiving them. It just means recognizing the part of yourself that might have made the same mistake if the world had tilted a little differently. Years passed. Files got boxed, names turned to case numbers, and new crimes filled the shelves. But every once in a while, something small would pull me back. A photograph resurfacing online, a rumor from another jurisdiction, whispers of similar disappearances in other countries. It's possible the veil didn't die with the Holsteads. Maybe it just changed form, learned to hide better. The thought doesn't keep me up at night anymore, but it never really leaves. I retired 2 years ago. The badge sits in a drawer with my watch both scratched in the same places. Some mornings I walk past the lake and think about the people who vanish, the ones whose stories get told and the ones who don't. I think about how quiet the world becomes once a mystery is buried deep enough, how even truth can fade if you let it. The Holsteads started as victims turned into predators, then ghosts. Somewhere in between, they left a trail of names that no one will ever fully untangle. But one little girl's bracelet found in a box under the desert still sits on a shelf in evidence-bright plastic beads that refuse to fade. I like to think that matters, even if it's only a symbol, even if no one ever says her name again. I've come to believe there's no such thing as closure, just distance. You learn to live with what you know and what you'll never know. And when the night gets too quiet, I still hear that voicemail sometimes, the slow, deliberate breathing of someone who wanted me to understand how close they'd been all along. I don't listen to it anymore. I don't need to. I know what it meant. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning that the line between looking for the truth and being consumed by it is paper thin, and once you cross it, there's no way back. Now, when I think of Nathaniel and Claire, I don't see their portraits or their mansion. I see a wide stretch of desert at dawn, the wind moving over dry grass, the smell of iron in the sand, the sun just beginning to break through. And somewhere under that light, 2 people who tried to outrun what they'd built, only to be swallowed by it. Their story never made front-page news, and maybe that's for the best. Some truths aren't built to hold the weight of headlines. They live quietly in the minds of those who saw them up close, shaping the way we see the world long after the evidence has turned to dust. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for curiosity, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering, even in silence, is sometimes the only kind of justice left.